Hi, my name is Sylvia Centeno, and I'm the Senior Director of Education and Research here at It's On Us. I'm here with one of my really good friends, Joan, and we are going to have a really free-flowing and honest conversation with you today. So thank you so much for joining us. If anyone would like to and feels comfortable, please feel free to put your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us, where you're zooming in from. Around the country or outside of the country in the chat. You should have full access to the chat. You should be able to send it publicly. Yep. So please feel free to do that. And we will get started. So before we get started, I guess I should tell you that we are going to talk about, our topic is two sides of the same coin, a survivor-centered conversation about individuals who cause harm. We're sort of bringing together my work experience and Joan's, and going to talk to you about why that has really been such a great experience.
Yeah, and thank you, Sylvia. I just want to thank you for the invitation, and just to let folks know that that Sylvia and I think over the years have had really important, sometimes difficult, but always fantastic conversations. So we want to see, can we bring that to this sort of more Zoom environment? Again, my name is Joan Tabachnick. My pronouns are she, hers, and I've been working in the field of sexual violence prevention for 25 years plus, and the focus of my work initially was around child sexual abuse prevention, and but focused specifically on how to prevent the perpetration of sexual violence. And one of the ways to sort of maybe become national expert is I feel I have a narrow enough niche that not that many people know anything about. So the niche I would say is I have the focus of my work has been on how to prevent the development of those behaviors in children and adolescents. And then a number of years ago, I ended up applied for and got a fellowship with the Department of Justice, the SMART office, which is responsible for sex offender registration and notification. And through that work is where I actually met Silvia. And also in that work, I really spent the last 4 years focusing on the campus environment. And so we want to take some of this conversation on the road, so to speak. We've never done this before, so please bear with us. And I hope that if you have questions that you will put them in the chat. We hope to maybe engage with you in some of that conversation as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. And just to go off of that, I'm going to give you the cliff notes of my bio, and then I'll give you my the unfiltered version of me for this presentation. Like I said, my name is Sylvia Centeno. It's me on the right. I'm the Senior Director of Education and Research here at It's On Us, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Before coming to It's On Us, I was at the Justice Department, like Joan mentioned, at the Office on Violence Against Women. I then worked under the Violence Against Women pillar at the Biden Foundation, and my background is in campus and youth sexual violence prevention and response programming specifically. The non-elevator pitch is that I am a really proud Boliviana. I grew up in Virginia, where most of my family is now, and have identified as a survivor since 2012. And my day-to-day fight is rooted in fixing systems that weren't created to serve people like me or any survivors. So I think that's why Joan and I get along really, really well. So moving on. So we just want to ask you as the audience, first off, thank you for coming to this session today, but we do want to ask if you can type in the chat, why did you care enough about this topic to come here today? Why are you a part of this conversation today?
Maybe when putting in the chat, partly I want to ask that question because the first time I presented with this kind of perspective, trying to understand those who cause harm, that one of the things that I presented at a conference around a sexual assault coalition conference, about 400 people, and literally nobody showed up for the conference and for my workshop. I sat there whole 90 minutes just sitting there thinking about why people didn't show. And so the fact that at this session here, we have quite a few people here. I'm really excited sort of just that people actually are coming here and at least have some level of curiosity.
I see someone said the dualities of survivorship and also causing harm. Absolutely. Christine said, I've not seen a restorative justice model for higher education. Very fair. We will talk about that. Let's see, the current system prevents perpetrators from admitting any wrongdoings and takes away survivors' agency in the process of restitution. Absolutely. And I want to understand something new about why people harm the way that they do. RJ is controversial for many reasons. Also very, very true. Really appreciate that perspective. We do want to say that, first off, provide a trigger warning that we will be talking about sexual violence in the session. If you disagree with anything that we say, we want to know. I think that the way that we have our partnership has really thrived is in asking some of those super tough questions. So if there's anything that anyone is wondering about or disagrees with what we say, please tell us. We are happy to have those conversations. That's why we're here. And I'm interested in creating healthy spaces for activism by keeping activists healthy mentally, physically, and financially. Absolutely, very many snaps to financially in this field of campus rape culture. All right, well, thank you so much. Those are really fantastic responses. We appreciate you being honest with us about why you came here today. And we hope that we can have a lot of those really important conversations. So here are some of the reasons that we are here today with you. We are going to talk about the fact that there do exist there are a lot of questions and few answers about the additional resources on the harm doers. And so because there is this desire, we want to have more of these conversations so that some of those research projects can actually happen. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the session, but Joan and I fought really hard to have a research project come to life on this topic. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. But our hope is that with time and conversation, this topic is actually going to be able to pick up some funding and really make way in this field. So we are hopeful and excited about that. We also know that there are a lot of untapped resources across the field and a lot of expertise. So we want to be having those conversations to pull all of those, again, really tough questions together so that we can lead to sustainable change in the system. And again, that research informed opportunity, like I mentioned. And Joan, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and partly that what we're you'll, as much as possible, we're going to be trying using person first language throughout this, but also know that some of the research that that we're going to be pulling from, there's sort of silos of information, and the biggest silos would be people who work with offenders, people who cause the harm, and people who have been harmed. It's being two different conferences, two different journal articles, different kinds of research. So part of what we want to do is but it's that's why we call it two sides of the same coin, because we're sort of trying to bring those together to see if we can get a more comprehensive picture. And I really love this quote from Tarana Burke, who is the founder of Me Too movement. And she said, I'm just going to read this aloud, that we can't move to a culture that eliminates sexual violence if we're not dealing with how harm doers become harm doers and how they undo that. Leaving them in a heap on the side of the road is not the answer. Allowing them to sneak back through the back door and acting like nothing happened is not the answer. there should be the expectation that there's real rehabilitation and that offenders have seen the light and want to make dramatic shifts in their behavior. And that last piece about wanting to make dramatic shifts in the behavior, when you think about the campus world, that's what we want to be focusing on. Because if a student is suspended and returns to campus, what is being done to make sure that they make that dramatic shift in their behavior? Or even if they're expelled and then end up on another campus, is there anything that's being done to make sure that they've learned something and that they've changed their behavior? So to me, maybe the largest argument for me is that understanding of why you should care, understanding the reasons why someone may cause harm. The reason understanding sort of perpetration is that we can hopefully use that to not only just respond differently, but also actually to prevent it before anybody is harmed. And that's sort of the guiding force, at least for me in my work. So back to you, Sylvia.
Thanks, Joan. So yeah, absolutely. I, really appreciate that quote as well. And we did want to make sure to go over the fact that not every survivor wants the same thing. One example of this, we can go back to, let's see, we have Simone Biles here, the Olympics that are happening right now. We saw the USA Gymnastics group talk about this and pay attention and try to solve some of these problems. But while we had all of those conversations, whose needs were the Olympics centering in that conversation? Gymnasts have been extremely frustrated with the way that the USA Gymnastics team was really hesitant to give up information on their reporting processes, really not cooperating as much as they should have with law enforcement or anyone who is looking into this. They have also come together to create some policies based on what happened with Larry Nassar and trying to fix it. However, again, who are they centering in these processes? I know one of them is that 33% of their committees and boards have to have, they have to have 33% of athlete representation on their committees and boards from now on. And yes, absolutely, this should be driven by survivors and they should be on the board. However, why is it that the only way that survivors can be believed is by the support of their peers? Why can we not just be believed? And why aren't they asking instead what survivors need? So I just think it's really important to, while we acknowledge that that USA Gymnastics is creating some changes that are very needed, and they are listening in some ways. Why are they listening? Is it because they actually want to hear survivors out about what their healing processes may be? Or is it because they're trying to cover up their own liabilities? I think that those are really important questions. And, the main question is 33% of athlete representation on boards and committees justice for all survivors? Is that what every survivor wants? No, every survivor is extremely different. So why is the process that USA Gymnastics needs to repair their reputation rather than to have survivors healing? Joan will talk a little bit more about this later, but we know the rates of recidivism, that those who cause harm and are put in jail very often cause harm again once they are out, and then the cycles continue, right? So that is what happens when the same options are given to survivors who are not given the opportunity heal in the ways that they really need to. And then I will pass it back to Joan.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. And I think obviously it's so important for survivors to be heard and for there to be a survivor-centered response. And if we actually listen, as Sylvia said, what one survivor will want will be very different than what another survivor wants. And if we begin to really acknowledge that what is also true is that the best interventions for one person who caused the harm is going to be different than the next person. So having different interventions, just as we want to have different options for survivors, we also want to have very different interventions for the people who cause harm. And when I talk about that, I don't mean to lessen the accountability for that individual, but that basically that what we say is key is we need to be able to hold those who cause harm accountable for their behaviors. So we don't want to dismiss it like it doesn't mean anything. We don't want to lump them all into one pot. That what we want to do is figure out how to have what we think of individualized responses that are really targeting that particular individual that is survivor-centered. Like that is sort of the key piece. And one of the ways through that is that, that in the next slide, a quote I really love by Mary Achilles, who is a victim advocate and also a restorative justice practitioner. And she sort of talks that victims frequently want longer time for offenders because we haven't given them anything else, or because we actually don't ask. We don't know what they want. So the system gives them door number 1 or door number 2, when maybe what they really want is behind door number 3 or door number 4. So begin to ask, what do survivors want is key to this. And then how do you pull this together? And I think what Mary Achilles and what Tarana Burke are talking is that we need to build our understanding about the individual who cause harm. And what I want to do is take maybe a little bit of I think of like this my nerd moment, to say, give you a little bit of background about what we do know about the people who cause harm. And to say that this is pulled from, certainly interviews and, qualitative work that I've done over the years, but also more importantly, it's taken from sort of the research that's out there. The research, again, is a little bit skewed. It's just talking about the people who actually have been reported and found responsible or have been convicted of a sex crime. We don't know that's representative of that larger group, but it's a body of information that we have largely been ignoring. So I want to have a chance to sort of share that in a really quick 5 minutes of overview. So in the next slide, I would say the main point or the main takeaway is that basically is not all people who abuse are the same, and not all behaviors are the same. So not all the behaviors that someone has has perpetrated will be the same. We tend to think only about rape and attempted rape, but there's a whole variety of behaviors I'll go to in a minute. But I want to be really clear that understanding the person who causes the harm does not lessen the impact on the person who has been harmed. It doesn't lessen the impact of their actions. So when I talk about a greater understanding, I don't mean to link this to any lesser accountability. But if we really want to, again, understand, if we really want to sort of create the best interventions, then we need to understand more about that individual who has caused the harm. So that really is sort of the next critical step. So in that slide, so I was just diving into the complexity a little bit. This is a sexual behavior continuum that I actually really appreciate that Cordelia Anderson developed like 20 years ago. But what I like about it is that it puts the behaviors on a whole continuum from what's healthy, helpful, appropriate, respectful, and safe, and moves it down sort of a whole continuum to what's, certainly I'm not saying that playful, flirting, teasing is not healthy and safe, but there is a little bit of a dynamic that's created, and depending on what the age may be different, or the power difference, that might actually move towards something that might be mutually inappropriate. Or if it takes a step further, it may be bullying, to sexual harassment, to maybe what's violent and illegal. And why I like having this continuum is that what it does is sort of says that if we only talk about what's violent and illegal, only talk about rape and attempted rape, then we say, oh, bullying or sexual harassment is not that bad. But on this longer continuum, you see exactly how far harassment is from what's healthy, helpful, and appropriate. So I like to put that on a continuum. The other thing I want to mention is that Mary Koss and a number of her colleagues in a 2015 article identified 42 different behaviors on college campuses that would fall under what we sort of would call like sexual misconduct. So if you think about that, 42 different behaviors along this line of this continuum. So there's a lot of different behaviors that we need to be addressing. So when you think about the individual, we want to think about not just that individual and the behaviors, but there's actually a number of other contexts we want to look at as well. So in the next slide, I want to sort of show you that actually, if we're going to be doing actually a risk assessment, if we're actually going to dive into this a little bit deeper, what we'd want to look at is not just the behaviors, that whole continuum of behaviors. You also want to look at the intentions behind that individual. Was it malicious? Was there actually somebody maybe that wasn't necessarily malicious, but they were drunk themselves, or maybe it's somebody who didn't understand the concept of consent. So their intentions have an impact on sort of what kind of intervention is going to make a difference, and also their motivations. That often in our field, we'll sort of talk about it's always about power and control. And when I hear that, actually, to me, a red flag goes up, because it sometimes is about power and control, but not always. Sometimes, that it could be about somebody simply wanting to be part of a group on campus, and it has nothing to do with that individual. Again, it doesn't lessen the harm, but that intervention of somebody who is desperately trying to be part of a group is their motivation. Or if you haven't seen, I guess one of the previous speakers, and actually a follow-up speaker, I think Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan from their book Sexual Citizens, talks about students often having sexual projects. Coming to school, that maybe what they do is they want to actually have sex. It's not about anything more than that. Again, but the impact can be huge. Because that's related to the next bullet here, which is what tactics did they use? Was there physical force? Was it coercion? Which puts us in a whole different level. If it's premeditated and planned, that also puts it on a different level. Or is it something which might be called situational? That the situation arose and they didn't fully link that to the fact that they understand what consent is. Again, the intervention is going to be different. The impact on the person who's harmed is no different. And then last, looking at their developmental or cognitive understanding. For those of you who work on campus, know that the developmental understanding of an 18-year-old can be very different than a 21 or 22-year-old. So someone coming to college for the first time, maybe he's never been away from home, never been away from their community, maybe in a very different cultural world than they've ever lived in before, not understanding what those cultural cues are, that can be very different than a high status senior. And also their cognitive understanding. I got a call, a couple of years ago now, but it was from someone from a college campus here in Massachusetts, and they had a situation of stalking where the person who was doing the stalking was on the continuum, and so he just did not understand that when someone said no to breakfast, it also meant no to lunch and no to dinner. And so he was going back and asking the same questions over and over again, which felt to the person like stalking. So the intervention for that, just suspending that individual, is going to have actually no impact. They need to actually understand cognitively how to interact. And that intervention, again, is very different. So as I look at this overall, to say that if you want to have the most appropriate intervention for someone, you have to look at their behaviors, their intentions, their motivations, their tactics, and their developmental cognitive understanding. And there are actually risk assessment tools out there that can help you look at that. So in the next slide, the bottom line, I would say, and I will stop talking in a second so we can have more of a conversation, is that when you think about which interventions are most effective, the answer to that is they have to be individualized. You can't have a one-size-fits-all. If we understand that survivors' experiences are very different, we have to understand that also the person who caused the harm, their experiences are also very different. And if we want to have somebody come back to campus or leave and go to a different campus, we need to think about what is that most effective intervention. So what in that individual, what those behaviors need to be changed? What do they need to learn? And one of the things that sort of drives me crazy when I hear you hear the intervention being write a paper that only addresses what's considered their cognitive understanding. They may be understood, but will it change their behavior? And the interventions that are make the most sense, or what called cognitive behavior treatment. So it's looking at both their cognitive understanding, but also what are the behaviors they need to change, and then what is around that individual? What are the environment that needs to change to make sure it encourages them to be safe when they return to campus? So that's the end of that particular piece. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions. I put my contact information there. So there's lots of research behind it. I'm not going into that because I don't have enough time. But I just want to like give you a sense of like what those individuals, and how do you take that to a larger scale? I'll turn this back over to Sylvia.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, absolutely. We really want to emphasize that there is no way to solve sexual violence without talking about both sides of this coin, as we've been saying, right? So just to take what Joan was talking about and sort of tie it back into that slide with some of the examples, if you remember when Time's Up was created as an organization, there was a big movement we were talking about the sexual harassment that was ingrained in the culture of our society, not just in the film industry, but in many industries, in most industries. And it wasn't just about the serial rapist that was committing harm. It was about the harm that was being caused in society in many ways that was also creating long-term and very real trauma. So that is something that is really important. And if we aren't paying attention to both sides of that, the harm that's being caused and why it's being caused, we aren't going to be able to come to any long-term at-scale solution to the problem of sexual violence. So from there, we wanted to take it back a little bit and talk about how Joan and I met. It was a while ago when I was at the Justice Department. We were both at the Justice Department. I was at the Office on Violence Against Women, and Joan was at the SMART office, or the Sex Offender Management Office, in separate buildings, but doing work that should have been done together. I can tell you that there was, when I came out of college, I was just an intern in this work and eventually was able to land in an internship at the Office on Violence Against Women. And, I got there and I took a lot of what I learned from talking to other student survivors on the campus, in that our campus wasn't listening to us about, having conversations where we could talk to our community and heal as a group. And there were no interventions that included the offender, like an educational piece for the offender, so that this wouldn't happen to other students on campus. So I took that to the Justice Department. And then the first conversation I remember I had with my manager, I said, I mentioned restorative justice. And I remember she immediately said, we do not talk about restorative justice here. This is an office that centers the needs of survivors, and we do not talk about the needs of offenders. And that's sort of the way that the conversation went for me when I was there, until I met Joan. And I remember our offices were not at all excited for us to meet and start collaborating, but I don't know what Joan said to the SMART office, but eventually we were able to get into the same room and we started having conversations about how our offices need to work together in order to change some of the policies and procedures that they're following that aren't actually changing this toxic piece of our society. So that's when we started working together. And earlier I talked about the fact that we need more research in this area, right? And we need more funding in order to have that research. So one of, and I will say there are a lot of things in between when this project happened and when we met. It was a lot of unpleasant conversations, a lot of being shot down because, again, I was being told that these conversations had to only be about survivors. And it was actually in our statute that we had to be survivor-centered. And the way that that was interpreted was that we couldn't talk about the harm doers, that they were the bad people. So we had to only talk about the survivors. And I fully believe that we can put survivors' needs first, and that includes talking about the harm that is being done and why it's being done. So, after a lot of conversations, both pleasant and unpleasant, Joan and I were able to get our offices to start having more regular meetings. And we created this project that would look at using restorative and transformative justice in higher education, in colleges and universities, specifically for sexual violence. And this hadn't been done before, especially on a national level. It had been done for other crimes, but not specifically for these crimes. And we were able to find the funding, and it was the first time that we were going to do this. Long story short, the administration changed. We didn't get to this. The money was switched over and put into something else. I don't know what. Neither of us are at either of these offices anymore. But I will say that I still look back on that, and I think that what gets me through this work and helps me push the needle is really the fact that my experience at OVW started with me being shushed because they didn't want me to say restorative justice or talk about the harm doers too loud, to us putting together a 5-year project that was so close to happening with tens and tens of people involved. We had a whole solicitation process with some of the biggest experts in this field that were going to come in and help us with this. And so that's what really gets me through and helps, it reminds me that although there are so many flawed pieces of our systems, and I have been let down by so many institutions, both literally my institution when I was a student, but also by the Justice Department, the Office on Violence Against Women, later by, I had work experiences in between and was also let down in those ways, that it is extremely helpful to have these partnerships that you don't expect. And so I really thank Joan for giving me some sustainability in this work. And we thought it was really important to share how we were able to come together from opposite sides of this work and this field, and why that's so important. And if we don't come together, I do not believe that we're going to be able to create sustainable change. So with that example, I will pass it on to Joan.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the time and I think maybe just skip through, just basically the main point that I was wanting to make. So I want to leave a few minutes for some questions as well. And but just to say that what I wanted to sort of say here is that maybe one of the advantages of being in this field for as long as I have is that I've seen such major changes. And so like before the 1970s, there really was complete silence around this issue. In fact, the moniker when I started doing this work, in the 80s and 90s was really about like how to break the silence. And it's sort of hard to imagine, but maybe this example I can say is a friend of mine who talked about who was a survivor and talked about when she was in her freshman psychology class. that she was told in the 1970s that child sexual abuse is the last taboo, it just doesn't happen. And I keep thinking about that moment of what it was like for that, 1 in 3 or 4 girls and 1 in 6 to 10 boys who were sexually abused, telling that their experience wasn't real. So we've actually come a really long way since the 1970s, and what I think of it is, like, if we think on the next slide, I think like what's happened, like, is that it's almost like I feel like we've broken the silence, but what we haven't done is, I can go through all of this, which I had a whole spiel about, I'm going to skip, but essentially, that we've absolutely broken the silence, that if you think about like all the different TV shows, the legislation, Me Too, all of these different pieces of research, but we haven't, in my mind, actually learned how to talk about this issue. And it's almost like we're still, like, we learned how to shout to break the silence, but we haven't learned actually how to engage in that, in my mind, those difficult conversations, and so sort of in the next slide, I would just sort of say, like, what I really appreciate is just the importance of just of having, and I think, to me, like, what I think of, like, with Sylvia, I feel very comfortable sort of like talking to people who don't want to talk to me. What I'm more surprised is when someone like Sylvia actually does want to engage with me. And I think these sort of unexpected partnerships is the absolutely right contradiction to sexual abuse. If sexual abuse and sexual violence thrives in isolation, then finding ways of being connected across these divides, across these silos, is absolutely the best way to sort of move that forward. So just I would sort of say, like, partly what it's a question for, that we want to sort of pose to you all is to think about is, like, well, what would be, if we think about where we've come from, like, where do we still need to go? What does like this decade that we're in now, what is this decade going to look like? And what can we say at the end of this decade that we have accomplished? And what I do hope is that we might be able to have some of these deeper conversations. So I want to just make sure we have enough time to get to some questions. So I'm going to end, maybe just turn this over to you to see, Sylvia, if you have a closing you want to put in here. But just to say that I really sort of appreciate so much, Sylvia, that you were sort of my unexpected, friendship here, as I went and talked to the whole Office of Violence Against Women, and got some sort of similar initial response that you were describing.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, let's end there so that we can get to some of the questions. And I know that there was one earlier. Joan, are you able to find that in the chat?
Yeah, so maybe just one I sort of addressed, so maybe in the text, and one I haven't yet. But one was that, that Christine was sort of talking about that she had several students who were on the Continuum who were brought forward in terms of stalking, and that she was getting pushback, saying that she needed to follow the conduct model consistently. And that sort of goes against sort of like what I'm sort of promoting here, which is it needs to be individualized. And partly when you sort of talk about consistently, what I often hear is that they're not, this is an institution who may be not looking at what's effective. And if you can shift the conversation to sort of how are we consistent, which is usually sort of the legal response. Like, how do you make sure that when one person is stalking, that they, and they're found responsible for that they get the same exact institutional response. And you may want to say that for example, that for someone who's stalking, that they're, or for whatever particular piece, that the consistent response, it might be that they're suspended, which is what some schools have done. But you want to make sure that there's an intervention that is linked to that in some way. So whether that if you do need to go to the consistency from a legal perspective, begin to introduce the question of what's effective as well. And then the other question, which, I'm not sure if you want to jump in on this as well, Sylvia, but that one of the things that Ash should have mentioned is that the slide I had around the sexual violence, the sexual sort of behavior continuum, that so the question of really what is, healthy, helpful, appropriate. And, and I think, first of all, that alone is a fantastic question. Like, what is that? What does that mean? I don't think we talk about what's healthy and appropriate, in anywhere in our society. But I want to be clear that by sort of having sort of flirting being at a different sort of place than what's, that what it means is just that you need to have a different level of understanding for that to be healthy and safe and appropriate. So if you're talking about BDSM, it's not saying that that's not healthy, but in order to engage in BDSM, you have to have a higher level of understanding, a higher level of communication, and it's more complicated. So it's easier as things get more complicated to have, if you don't have two people, especially I'm thinking in the college environment, who don't have the education around it, you need to have more sort of safety put in place for that. So as you move down the continuum, that if you sort of like flirting, it's not saying that that absolutely is healthy, but you have to make an understanding like who are you flirting with? What's the impact of that? What are the cultural contexts for that? So that's why it's on a different place in the continuum, but it's not if I'm in any way did not imply that that's not healthy or helpful in any way. So I know some other questions are coming in. Yeah, so just someone else mentioned this. One of the pictures we had with the Sujata Baliga, who does some amazing work in terms of a youth diversion program. So that's a great example. Someone has said like there aren't a lot of programs out there around restorative justice, but there are some really wonderful examples that can be pulled from different environments. So certainly it's the work of Sujata Baliga. If you have not looked into that, I would absolutely do that. The Prism Project, which and David Karp and Karen Williams does some fantastic work in the campus world. There's the University of Vermont actually has a federal grant to look at restorative justice, not just around sexual violence, but it has included some of that component and partners. So there's some really wonderful programs that are out there that would just suggest looking into.
Yeah, and I will say that we in some of our work, like we definitely want to say thank you to all the folks that have been doing this work, like David Karp and Sujata Baliga, because we used a lot of their projects to that's I think what really got our offices to finally start working together and to understand why we have to work together in order to end this violence. So huge shout out and thank you to all the people that have been doing this work for a long time. And then I think we do have time for one more question. Joan, I saw someone asked, what do you, the workers in this field, do for your self-care? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I think that absolutely sort of the self-care is such a critical question, and I think it's absolutely different for everybody. For me, one of the things that, because it's hard to get full employment around prevention, because there's not, as a society, we don't tend to invest in prevention. So I always do make sure that's part of my consulting project. I do what I call as a joy project, which is basically the idea that has nothing to do with sexual violence. So I work a lot in my community doing strategic planning with local community organizations. So that's part of the way that I balance my work life around very difficult issues with something that I think is complete to joy project. I also just make sure that I do things like, because of the world, especially in this this COVID world that we're in, that I make sure that every Friday I turn my computer off for, I'm Jewish, so for Shabbat, and then I don't actually look at my phone, look at my computer at all for at least 24 hours, and that actually has been a huge relief to make sure that I just have a way of just turning off completely. So maybe just turn that back to you, Sylvia.
Yeah, and thank you. I think this is always a really important question. So I do appreciate it. I think that something that I do a lot is I watch a lot of really bad TV shows. So I will, things that are not at all relatable. And I also have a dog, so we'll go for runs, or we'll just hang out and do nothing together. But I do also want to, just say that it is completely fine. And this is something that I have you know, spent a lot of time debating and have barely come to, but it is really fine to be upset sometimes and to just be angry. And sometimes self-care just means acknowledging the way that I am feeling and sort of sitting in those emotions. So I think for me, I can't move past anything without fully like sitting down and really thinking about it and allowing myself to acknowledge that I'm feeling that way. So I know that seems to be like the opposite form of self-care, but that is really, it's been extremely important for me to really sit in those emotions at times when I really need to. All right. Well, thanks. We are right up on the end of our time here. And I do want to give folks time to switch over if they would like to tune in to our conversation with Justin Baldoni and our amazing executive director, Tracy Vichers. This is definitely not the last conversation we're going to have on this topic. Joan, I cannot thank you enough. Would not be able to make it through this work without you. But do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share?
Well, first I want to say I love the playing the chickens and goats I had a friend of mine just did goat yoga, which I thought was fantastic. So I think just finding whatever that makes your heart sing is really important for that self-care. And just to say that I really that what's really for me having done this work as long as I have. And so maybe the age is that it's really, to me, exciting to see how the conversations have changed. And so I think maybe the last thing I would say is that, as we get frustrated, as we do with what doesn't happen and what needs to happen, also take the time to see like what we have accomplished, because the fact that we're, that there's an organization like It's On Us, I could not have imagined something like that was started by a presidential initiative is just phenomenal. And I would not have imagined that 20 years ago. So I would just say, like, if you really just imagine where you want to be in 20 years and then don't give up and find people that you can do this with, because that's the part that really has made a huge difference for me. And I can't tell you how much of that that means to me, to have people like Sylvia being sort of having my back as I do this important work, and I hope I do the same for you, Sylvia. So find your partners in crime and make change. We need that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to completely echo that. There will be tough conversations. The systems that are in place and that drive a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the money to fund the work that we do are so fully ingrained in paper, and it's going to take a lot to change them, but find your people, and it just makes it so much more doable. I don't even want to say easier, because it's not. But thank you all for your work. Someone asked about, President Biden is talking on Thursday, and you can access that on any of our platforms. It will be live on all of them. I would recommend using YouTube. That's probably the most clear platform, and you don't have to have it on your phone. But more to come on that. We will be pushing it out between now and then as well. So thank you all so much. Both of our contact info are in the chat if you need us. Thank you for the great comments and questions. Thank you, Joan, for literally everything. And we'll see you soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care. And thanks for the invitation, Sylvia.